All right, I think we are ready for our panel. They're already here. It's that quick. That's the beauty of virtual events, is there's no kind of walking on and off stage. They just appear in front of me. So welcome back to our next session. We're going to be talking about the nuts and bolts of member motivation. And motivation is a huge topic, and something that we kind of deal with on a daily basis as community professionals. So I would love to welcome to the stage BIND co-founders and authors of Organising Communities, Peter Staal and Kirsten Wagenaar, and CMX Book Club host and community program manager at Spotify, Jamie Johnston.
Hi there.
Hey, thanks, Valentina. And hello, everyone. I'm delighted to welcome Peter and Kirsten here today to talk about their book, Organising Communities. It covers all aspects of community management, but today we're going to focus in on chapter 10 of their book, which is about motivating members. Before we get stuck into the topic at hand, I'd love it if you could just tell us a little bit about your background and how you came to write this book.
Yeah, thank you, Jamie. My background is actually, I'm a biologist by profession, and Kirsten is actually a psychologist by profession. And I think the first time we met was about 10 years ago, when Kirsten just founded a professional association for community managers, which I was a part of as well. The both of us been freelancing as community managers for quite some time. And during that time, we always had discussions about, well, there isn't a Dutch book out there yet, a book which goes into Dutch examples, which goes into community management, and which is basically also an inspiration for others to learn more about communities. So the moment we started BIND together, we actually decided this is the time, and this is the moment we should write a book together, and that's basically how everything went.
Yeah, and I think important to add also is that, of course, when you are in the field for 10, 12 years, it's so great that when you have new customers that you can introduce your knowledge through a book. So you can just tell them, okay, so we're giving you this training, it's 2 times 3 hours or 4 times 3 hours, but we also have a book that you can share among your colleagues. So it makes also the whole transition of the knowledge so much easier.
Yeah. Well, it's as I say, you cover all aspects of setting up a community, right through to managing it. And I guess for our European audience, especially because there's a lot of literature from North America, but it's great to see a bit more of a European bent and European examples of communities.
Yeah.
Did you have a clear audience in mind? Like, was it a European audience, and is that different? Like, who's the book for, and maybe who is it not for?
I think when we started writing, we had, first of all, a Dutch audience in mind, but the ultimate goal for us was to also release it to an international crowd. That's why we released the English version on Amazon. And I think in terms of target groups, there were basically 2 types of groups. So first of all, there was the community manager struggling to get their communities off the ground, looking for practical solutions, tactical bits which would help him or her manage their communities. And the other part was getting more and more companies ready for communities in general, to provide an inspirational resource using examples from other companies to make sure that managers read those, board members read those, and thought that maybe a community could be something for us in our particular organization as well.
Yeah, I think what we really wanted is to write first like a handbook, like a basic book, a book that's really inspired. On the one hand, would have a lot of cases and examples. And on the other hand, we also wanted to give some concrete, tools for community managers to manage their community with. And I must say that was quite a challenge, because of course, when you're going to write that book, you want to put everything in. So it's hard to think of a target group. You just want to grasp anybody. So we had a lot of discussion about that. I mean, we started talking about a book, I think, Peter, like 5-6 years already ago. And in the end, we just thought, let's just write are the way we worked for the last couple of 8 years, and just write it down. And we came up with those two target groups. Yeah.
Right. And that way of writing, was the structure then, did you have that clear in mind, or was it more a case of getting it all out and then working on structure?
I think those are where the most of the discussions took place. So what we did for the writing process is we decided beforehand that we basically co-created the structure, and I will be the one writing the book, and Kirsten will be the one responding to the book, giving critical feedback, and that's the way we managed through the process. And I think because we are a consulting agency and we train a lot of companies and we help a lot of companies setting up communities, we knew what type of topics people would be interested in. So things from the practical standpoint, things from the inspirational standpoint, those were actually quite immediately clear. And we used the companies we worked for as basically a validating resource.
Yeah.
Okay. Anything to add, Kirsten, or? No,
I agree with Peter. It was, the structure was very important. That's what we also heard from our editor. And then, of course, you have to have your target group in mind. So we really thought, okay, we want to get first. I think what was very important for us is to get out there what our view on communities was. Because I remember that since 2008, 2009, we had...
Oh, maybe lost her. Okay, well, we'll just carry on, and Peter will just move into crux of the book, chapter 10, and motivating participants. So when it comes, and this is where I kind of was hoping to speak to Kirsten. So when it comes to this, like, you hear me? Oh, you're back. I think we lost you for a minute. I'm just saying we're just going to move on to.
Now I'm back.
Okay, good. We're going to talk about the crux of the book. And so
I don't see you moving.
I think there's a little delay for you, Kirsten, but I'll just ask my question. So when it comes to the psychology of motivation, how theoretical were your approaches? Is this a subject? It is a subject that Kirsten has studied. And is that where she had the biggest influence, or, how did you approach the sort of theory of motivation?
I think it goes both ways. So we looked at the self-determination theory, because that's basically, if you look into what motivates people in general, you end up using self-determination theory, because that's basically the bottom line of every type of motivation. And we used basically also the practical input from working with clients from day to day. And as that went, it was a natural process. So Kirsten and me, by the nature of our job, we speak to each other quite a lot. So when I was writing the book, I had discussions with her on that particular subject, and we used those discussions to feed into the book. Okay, yeah. And so it's that mixture of like practical application and some of that theory. Now, I don't want to make too many assumptions about what everyone's knowledge is on the subject, but can you just talk a little bit about what intrinsic and extrinsic motivation is, with some relatable examples that make sense to people? Well, basically, I would say extrinsic motivation is doing something for a reward afterwards, and intrinsic motivation is doing something that is a reward in itself. So that basically discriminates the two. And when I train people for community management courses, I always like to use an example of my children. For instance, I really have to reward them for them to do their homework. And ultimately, I hope that they will become intrinsically motivated, that learning would be a reward in itself, and they would consider themselves self-learners. So there you would basically have the discrimination between the two. Okay, so it's this idea of using some extrinsic motivation tactics to stimulate, as you call it, this intrinsic motivation. And so for community managers, the same goes, right? You can try and reward people initially to get them contributing, and then they find their own internal kind of motivation from there. Okay. Now, social validation is a key aspect of converting new members to regulars, and you talk about this, but that it must feel authentic
and it must feel kind of, specific and unique rather than sort of cutting, pasting and sort of just these low value thank yous. So this maybe feels achievable in the early days of setting up a community, but what about larger and more mature and large communities? How do you sustain that sort of personal recognition?
Kirsten, this is one you want to take?
I thought you were going to take it. My camera is doing I think I'm back now. No, you just go take this one because I didn't prepare for this one.
Yeah, I think to begin with, it comes down to educating your ambassadors or your core group, and also educating your members so that they see the value of reciprocity, for instance, and they also see the value of recognizing, rewarding, socially validating someone's input. So, for instance, someone asks a question, you should, for instance, provide an answer, but also provide them with recognition, with a genuine thank you, in order for that to become social validation reward. Okay,
so sort of demonstrating, I guess, as well, and instilling some of that behavior in other people.
Yeah, I think leading by example goes a long way. So we always tell that to the ambassadors, and I always tell that to the community manager as well. So that, well, basically the norms and values you want for your community, those are the ones that need to be embodied by a community manager and ambassadors as well.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Another point you make is that, physical and financial rewards, they can work well as part of an overall kind of reward system and gamification system, but that you also need a strategy for rewards that can be used unexpectedly and sparingly. Can you tell us why that's so important?
Well, okay, shall I take this one? We've been discussing this a lot lately with the team, and I think the whole thing with gamification is maybe you talked about it when I was gone, but you want people, on the one hand, you want to be very transparent in what kind of behavior you want to stimulate. And on the other hand, you don't want to take away from the intrinsic motivation. So you do want a reward, but you don't want it to become an extrinsic motivator, so that people start to actually show that behavior just to get that reward. So it's a very delicate balance you have to find always. That it has to be like a program. It has to be transparent, so that people know what they're doing it for. But on the other hand, it's so good to now and then reward specific behavior that is maybe just out of the more standard program that you're offering.
If you go into the unexpectedness of the reward, I think if you want to have a good book on that, you should read Hooked, which is excellent, and it goes into the mechanics of social platforms and why unexpected rewards are so good. So basically they function as sort of a slot machine. You know that there's a reward to be gained, but you never know when it's going to happen. And those kind of tactics tend to be very seducing for people.
It's like the intermittent, intermittent reinforcement. That we have that experiment with rats. That, if they don't know exactly when they're going to get the food or the drink, they will become obsessed almost with it.
Getting it, okay. And that's Nir Eyehol's book that you're talking about. Hooked. Yeah. A really good book. Okay, and I think you also made the point there. It's kind of an ever-changing thing, right? So as a community manager, as your community matures, as your members have been there a long time or less time, then you need to keep reviewing how you're managing those rewards. Okay, so we're going to move on a little bit then to the theory. And Kirsten, this is where I did ask a question before. Glad that you're back and with us now, full-bodied. So can you talk a little bit about the self-determination theory? Because obviously you use it to then structure a large part of this chapter. So can you tell us a bit about that and why it's important in the setup of our communities?
Well, what we find is that when we work with organizations, they're always very focused on getting the best content. And they're always very focused on how to get people back and just to have the greatest content, and then people will return, members will return. And we find it so important that organizations understand that there's a whole psychology behind why people join a group, what they need to be able to do within that group to be able to come back, to feel that they can be themselves, that they're seen and heard, and that they actually can, tell themselves that it's worth it, that they're putting time and energy in that group. And the self-determination theory really makes it very clear, on autonomy and relatedness and competence, that when you have, as a person, you have your own tools within a group to make a change, to have an impact, to have influence. When you have your own possibilities to relate to other people, to choose with who you want to network, who you want to know, who you want to have conversations with. And on top of that, if you can also really develop your expertise and see that you're becoming better and knowing more, then those three things are extremely valuable for people, and they make them, decide to come back to a group because it's immediately value to them. So it's so much more than just content. Of course, content plays a large part in all of this. It's like the glue that puts it all together, but it's just like the tipping of the iceberg. So I think that's why it's important for people to understand the psychology of, why people join groups.
Yeah. Okay, so you talked there with the theories made up of competence, autonomy, and relatedness. So if we start with autonomy, actually, because you just mentioned it there, like for me and for lots of community builders that I've spoken to, this is always like quite a fundamental challenge. The idea of community and this idea of autonomy and letting go, relinquishing control. It's something that comes up, and for people that are, less versed in community, and for quite a lot of your stakeholders, this is something that they can really struggle with. And yet you cite this obviously as a key factor. So do you have any tips for community builders because most people are often caught in the middle of this, right? Between the organization and between what they want to do for the community?
I can perhaps tell a little bit about it. I would say we look at the big examples, for instance, Wikipedia, TEDx, and we mentioned those examples in our book as well. One thing they do really well is they provide freedom of choice. So autonomy is all about freedom of choice. That doesn't mean to say that anything goes. So it's the perception of freedom of choice. So within certain boundaries, because all communities have boundaries, you have a range of options that allow you to participate or contribute value to the community. So Wikipedia, for instance, it allows you to edit errors, fix broken links, translate articles before you even get to the point that you're writing entire articles. So for people, that's kind of a reassuring. They can mix and match according to their competencies and their skill sets. And we try to mimic that with our own communities as well.
Yeah, and I think on top of that, the community managers or the organizations that really struggle with autonomy and giving away control, usually they don't have a strategy in place. So we always advise organizations from scratch to really think it through, what you want your community, to add up to. What is the goal of your community? What kind of behavior do you want? What are the boundaries within your around your community where members can move? And the more clear the organizations they have a vision for this, the better they can start to invite people who can accept this, who belong within that boundary. And then usually it's about managing expectations. So it's really about, I think, in general, organizations not being really aware of how communities work, how they can work. Usually we do not have that situation a lot of times because we help them with the strategy and we help them think about these kinds of scenarios that they might encounter.
Okay, yeah, that's great. And there's lots we talk about the autonomy. But if we just flick a little bit to competence, and the way that you describe this a little bit is a couple of things. Part of it is setting goals, and you talked about that, like so people develop it and they learn. Another thing that everyone understands and has come across is that this gamification idea of like leaderboards and dashboards and things. And there's quite often a bit of debate around the use of those. So I thought that might be a good one if you could get your view on good examples of this and perhaps some scenarios where they shouldn't be used.
I think if you look at gamification, one of the top examples is always Stack Overflow. If there's one platform that really got the principles of gamification, it's Stack Overflow. And I think when it comes to leaderboards, what you should do well is not provide a leaderboard of all time, because that can be discouraging for newcomers. Refresh your leaderboard, for instance, every day, every week, or every month, so that the dice are rolled anew every morning and everyone has a chance to make it to the top of the leaderboard. I think another thing that you should do is think about reputation and tie leaderboards to reputation community members have, because then it moves more towards intrinsic motivation instead of extrinsic motivation. And another thing I'd like to say is that with all these things, these tactics, it doesn't work for everybody. So these leaderboard type activities tend to work for people who are competitive in nature and the status seekers. And for other types of people, you probably use other tactics.
Okay.
Yeah. It's like what I want to add is that we always look at these huge online communities where mostly younger people are active, or their customer communities. But we work with so many different types of communities with so many different target groups that are older men that have totally no need for gamification kind of structure. So we use different kinds of way of stimulating their behavior. There's so much to say also about that.
Yeah. Oh yeah, we're scratching the surface here. So yeah. We're conscious of time. And so I just want to touch on another principle. We've got two kind of left. So one is relatedness. And this is this idea, that you need to instill relatedness into your communities. Otherwise, is it really a community, right? How can we make sure that members do build these connections and deepen relationships? And why is it so important?
One way to do that, and I think this is hard in COVID and Corona times, is to physically meet up with each other. Because I think the genuine, real, heartfelt relationships, they get a chance to be created during those offline meetups. And one of the things that really works well to do that is basically trying to people to self-disclose personal information, so that there's really this personal connection, and it's not all shouldn't just only be about the topic of the community, but should also be informal, should be about families, should be about your insecurities and those types of issues.
Okay. And just my final little bit. So you actually add another part to this model, which is purpose. And you talk a little bit about how bringing the community's mission to life and the organization's overarching mission can be really important. And I really liked this, and I think it relates to relatedness and this idea of like storytelling. And you even talk about the campfire, and I think all of that, and you're talking about events and bringing people together. So I think there's a really neat way to sort of package this final part up. There's something very personal and yet something quite timeless about all of that. So storytelling and this idea of an overarching mission, can you give us some examples of where you've seen this done really well, and again, why this is important?
I think if I can take this one, Peter, we do this with basically all our clients. So we start the community off with this core group, and right from the scratch, we start building this identity of the community. So who are we? What do we stand for? What are our values? What do we want to work towards? How do we want to treat each other? How does it feel to be in a transparent, safe environment? When doesn't it feel safe anymore? So we usually start off with like this mission statement built by the community. So I think that's a very important part of this purpose, like having an identity and understanding, why you're there and why you're putting on all the time, your energy. And I think another one very important is to do things together. Many communities are all about knowledge sharing, developing, but it's so important to have activities, to have fun, to build like a history together also, and to see where you came from and where you're working towards. So to see that you're developing, not only the community is developing, but you also as a person within the community, you're developing towards something bigger than yourself. I don't know if you want to add something, Peter.
No, that's a good answer, I think.
Well, very nice. I'd like to just finish up I think we have one or two questions from everyone that's been listening. So thank you very much, Peter and Kirsten. I intend to speak more with you and talk more about your book. There'll be a podcast that's coming out to support these book club events. So thanks from me. Great. And I'm going to hand over now to Valentina, I think, who's just got a couple of questions from the audience. Thanks again.
Thank you.
Hello. Yes, we have a few questions, two in fact. So we're going to get straight to it. Favor asks, what other tactics aside from gamification can be used to encourage intrinsically motivated engagement in new / budding communities? I don't know who would like to pick up that question.
Gee, there's a lot. I think I already read that question earlier. What I would advise the person who asked the question to do is read the latest book of Amy Jo Kim. She wrote one of the books on community building, which is already 20 years old, and I still think that's a really good book on communities. And from there on, she went more into the field of games and using those tactics that she learned from community building to engage people in games. And that book goes really in depth on those types of tactics.
Great. Okay, one more quick question. Eddie says, to reward / encourage contributors, we send out swag, t-shirts, etc. Any other rewards spring to mind? Kirsten, any thoughts?
Well, what we see organizations do a lot is they usually have like a website or a newsletter. So they have a stage to put people on. So people are super flattered when they're being interviewed, when they get a photo shoot, when they get a day within the company and they show them around. So just give them personal attention, making them feel special. That could be, something that works almost for every kind of person.
Great, thank you. Well, that's all we've got time for. Please give a big round of applause in the chat for Jamie, Kirsten and Peter. Thank you so much for sharing so much great knowledge on member motivation.